A big day in the SEC and for the Georgia Bulldogs. The 2021 schedule has been released. I'm going to go through it with you game by game here. Dean Legge from Dog Post, making you a smarter Georgia fan. Thanks for listening, watching, and subscribing to the site. So right off the bat, some of these are games that we already knew about, but we're going to go through them all nonetheless. The opener for Georgia against Clemson on September 4th. That game will be in Charlotte, a 50-50 split in the stadium. That game will almost certainly be at night and probably on ABC. So that's how Georgia will start the season. That's Georgia's toughest game of the year. Then you've got UAB in Athens a week later. That's on September the 11th. So that'll be 20th year anniversary of September the 11th. I don't know if Georgia's got anything planned, but my suspicion is that they probably will have something for that tragedy. And then September 18th, the South Carolina Gamecocks come to Georgia. So Georgia will play Carolina in two of their three most recent SEC football games. It'll be a very odd thing that Georgia has played them in November after Thanksgiving and then played them a year later in September. So, Carolina will come to Georgia with a brand new head coach, I'm assuming new schemes, but Carolina and Athens week 3. Week 4, Georgia goes to Nashville. That's a game that Georgia should certainly win, kind of going away. Then Arkansas the week after that, that's October 2nd. That's the traditional crossover weekend in the league, but that's not going on this year. Just Georgia, Arkansas. That game will be in Athens. That will be a game that you kind of want to watch. I don't think Georgia loses that game, but it's a game you want to watch. Then you got to go to Auburn. So that's October 9th. That game is settling in to the early October time frame. That's when Georgia used to play Tennessee. That's where Auburn will be most of the time now. So Georgia, Auburn on October 10th. That game is at Auburn. All right. Kentucky comes the week later. That's October 16th. That's a typical time for the Cats to come to Athens just before the game in Jacksonville. And this year, they will come on October 16th. And they got the bye week before the Gators. There's a lot of byes that week. Georgia, Florida, Auburn, LSU, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas A&M all have bye weeks that week. For Georgia, that bye has become a big deal. It's really changed the fortune of the Dogs in that series. So Georgia and Florida. Then a week later, the day before Halloween on October 30th, so Georgia, Florida, down in Jacksonville. The week after that, Georgia hosts Missouri. So Missouri has been all over the schedule. Georgia's played out there early. Georgia's played, Missouri later in the year in Athens. So there's really no traditional time for Missouri because Missouri is not a traditional team in the SEC. So Georgia will host them the week after Georgia, Florida. And then, and this is the part that's so odd, playing Tennessee November 13th. And that will conclude Georgia's SEC schedule for 2021. But playing Tennessee that late, that's going to be like Georgia playing Mizzou in the frigid 40s that when they played them out in Columbia this past, I was in December. So that could be a real cold weather game for Georgia. And this is a program that doesn't play a lot of cold weather games. They almost never in the past have played November games north of Athens. They played cold games in Auburn. They played cold games in Athens. But a game in Knoxville in the mountains in November, that should be a colder game. We'll just have to see. Week after that, in Athens, Charleston Southern comes to town to get their paycheck and a loss, and then Georgia Tech in Atlanta. So to close the season out on November 27th. So when you look at this schedule, obviously the beginning of it is probably the toughest part because you're playing Clemson to open the season, but this is spread out about as well as you could do it if you were Georgia and you're asking to be spread out. No back-to-back games that are insane. Arkansas, Auburn, that could be tricky, I guess. Florida, Missouri, or Missouri, Tennessee, maybe, those games. But there's no, like in years gone by, they will, in 2008 they played at LSU and then they played in Jacksonville a week later. They played at Arizona State, and then they played Alabama a week later. I mean, we're not seeing any of that sort of stuff for Georgia. And I don't. You never should call for an undefeated season, but particularly when you're opening with a team as good as Clemson. But when you look at this thing, there's no team they can't beat on here, and there's a lot of teams that can't beat them. The tricky games to me are Arkansas, Auburn, and Missouri. I think Auburn, Clemson, and Florida will have Georgia's attention completely. So I think saying Auburn being tricky, but I like this schedule. I think it's concludes with a whimper in many ways. I mean, Missouri could be tricky. I don't know. I find it hard to believe Tennessee is going to be good in 2021. So at minimum, you got 3 games to conclude the season where you can kind of get ready for a run-up to the college football playoff and the SEC championship game. I mean, Georgia should win the SEC East. This isn't going to be one of these years where people are wondering who's going to win the East. I mean, they will be the consensus favorite. In fact, if you don't pick Georgia this year, come on, what are you doing? But everyone else, Florida, the problem for the Gators is, and these are both home games, but they're playing Alabama and Tennessee back-to-back. Now, no, they're not going to, them losing to Tennessee I find hard to believe. And then you've got LSU in Baton Rouge off, and then Georgia. That's tough. And then to conclude the season, they have Missouri and Florida State. Maybe those games sound more difficult than what they really are or will be, but think about this home schedule if you were Florida. This is a great home schedule. Florida Atlantic, Alabama, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, Samford, and then Florida State. You get Florida State, Alabama, and Tennessee, all 3. Those are as big a games as you get in period, and you got them all at your house. So, and they could never host Alabama and LSU in the same season, so that's impossible. This is as good as it gets for the Gators. In terms of at home, it's also they could lose one of those games. They will lose one of those games. I don't think they'll lose to Tennessee. Florida State. Let's just see what happens with the Noles. But for Georgia, that's why I say, Alabama and LSU on the Gator schedule, they're just not going to survive that. Plus everything else. They totally could lose to Missouri and Columbia. I don't see them losing to Carolina. I don't see them losing to Vanderbilt or Tennessee. Could they lose in Lexington to Kentucky? Yeah, they could. They definitely could. So I think for Georgia, they clearly are the cream of the crop in the East. In the West, it should be Alabama, and schedule is not easy. Miami to start the season, and you kill Mercer, and you go to Florida, you host Southern Miss, you host Ole Miss, and then you go to Texas A&M, you go to State, you host Tennessee. That's a tough stretch of 3 games. They shouldn't lose them, but that's a tough stretch of 3 games. And then the close of the season for Alabama is challenging, I would say. You've got LSU at home, New Mexico State, and then you host Arkansas before going to Auburn. Now, they should not lose more than one of those games. Maybe they shouldn't lose any of them, but that's not an easy close to the year. So that will shape who gets to Atlanta to presumably play the Dogs. LSU is going to Pasadena to open up against UCLA. Then they got a couple gimme games. They play at State. They should win that game. They host out Auburn. They should win that game. Kentucky and Lexington. They should win that game, but, and they host the Gators. They should win that game. Ole Miss and Oxford, that could be tricky. They go to Tuscaloosa. They should lose that game. They host Arkansas. That could be tricky. And, of course, a gimme game before Texas A&M. So you're seeing what happened here at the end of the year is that the SEC and its broadcasting partners have shifted more difficult games and more appetizing games to the end of the year. What do I mean by that? Alabama, Arkansas, week 12. Auburn, South Carolina, Week 12. Florida, Mizzou, Week 12. Vanderbilt, Ole Miss used to be at the beginning of seasons. That's Week 12. I said Florida, Mizzou, South Carolina, Auburn, Texas A&M has a gimme game just like Georgia. But that what you saw in 2019 was Georgia eat a late game in the year. They did a favor for the league in getting that Texas A&M game so late. I mean, they played Auburn, Texas A&M to close the season before Georgia Tech. And that was challenging for sure. And now you see they don't have that this year. But everybody else has a tricky game or a challenging game. I mean, Auburn, South Carolina, and Columbia, I mean, that's going to be a tough game for both those teams. I mean, any SEC game the week before your rivalry game is not fun. Georgia doesn't have to deal with that this year. They have Charleston Southern and then Georgia Tech. If Georgia gets to the Missouri game, that would be the game after Florida, undefeated, they're going to probably get to the playoff. Because even if they were to lose somehow to Missouri, I just don't, which I don't see. They're not going to lose to Tennessee, Charleston Southern, or Tech. And you get the championship game, which you need to win, okay? But if the ACC is going to get two teams in who had an undefeated and a one-loss, you're going to get that from the SEC. I don't know who's going to come from the West. It should be Alabama. The other thing that's good here, too, with this schedule, you have multiple out-of-conference games where the SEC could do serious damage to the other leagues. You've got Georgia, Georgia Tech, Florida State, Florida, Kentucky, Louisville, Miami, Alabama. You have Georgia, Clemson. Those alone games could be very difficult for the ACC to recover from, if you want to call it that. You also have Arkansas, Texas, which is in Fayetteville. That's a game Arkansas better figure out how to win. Totally winnable for them. And then, LSU, UCLA, which is, different. But, Georgia will be playing in a game like that here soon. And then Auburn, Penn State. That's a game to watch for sure, as well as Colorado, Texas A&M. So you've got a couple crossover Pac-12s. You've got one Big Ten crossover. You've got one Big 12. You've got a bunch of ACC, SECs. So you can do, if you're, I didn't mention Clemson, South Carolina, because I don't think Carolina is going to be in the same universe as Clemson. But you can do, if you're the SEC, a lot of good for yourself if you take care of business in those games. Mississippi State, NC State, another one. Mississippi State, Memphis, which is an interesting. I mean, Mississippi State has a brutal start to the year. Louisiana Tech to start the year, then NC State, then Memphis on the road, LSU, Texas A&M. They might have 2 wins in that. They could lose all of those games. But, Kentucky took care of NC State if my math's correct last year. So it's a good setup for Georgia. We're going to talk a lot in the next 8 months about Georgia and Clemson. And there's a lot to talk about. But you got to get to Atlanta one way or the other if you're Georgia. And the most challenging games are Clemson, at Auburn, and Jacksonville. None of those games are in Athens. 2 of them are neutral field. The other big thing to remember here for Georgia, and this is something that's pretty normal for them these days. Here's where they play these games. Charlotte, 50% or more Georgia people. Athens, Nashville, 50% or more Georgia people. Athens, Auburn, true road game. Athens, Jacksonville, 50% or more. Athens, Knoxville. That's a true road game. Athens, Atlanta, 50% or more, Georgia. They're going to play 2 true road games, Georgia, this year. 2, that's it. And then you get to Atlanta for the SEC championship game. That's going to be at least 50% Georgia people. Depends on who they play. And then you go to a semifinal or whatever. I mean, no, this is going to be fan-friendly. They're going to have a lot of opportunities to be the home team, even when they're not playing in Sanford Stadium. That's a big deal because playing at Tech, playing in Nashville, those Bayou home games are just not in the state. Dean Legge from Dog Post, making you a smarter Georgia fan. Thanks for watching. Make sure you check out this playlist up here. We'll see you over on the website.